either idiocy or lies being peddled by Tuberville because they don't want the people creating the wealth to be able to have a say in its distribution. That's the fundamental thing.
Are you on? Which side are you on?
We're going to keep talking about Tommy Tuberville, though, because also last week, Dartmouth won. Dartmouth college basketball players won their union. They had a union election and they won. The first NCAA team to win a union election. Incredibly exciting, historic, and totally needed because these athletes are bringing in millions of dollars for their schools, and they are not being compensated adequately for it. People will say they're compensated by scholarships, but of course, you know, the even if you count the sticker price of the scholarship, which is obviously not the cost to the school, right? What is the actual cost to the school to educate a single person? Virtually nothing, right, is the answer to that. But even if you look at the sticker price, it is so far below the value that they are creating for these universities. It is criminal the amount of wealth that they're creating that is being taken from them and thrown into the pockets of, you know, of head coaches and the universities and all of this. And so, you know, they need to get their slice of the pie. And absolutely, unionization is the best way to do that because unionization will literally give them a seat at the table and will help them work out the best formula for compensation possible and keeping the game competitive. And that's how the NFL works. That's how the NBA works. That's how the NHL works. That's how all professional sports work, is that the players have a union and they negotiate, and they also work to try to keep the sport competitive and make sure that, you know, and actually probably what would happen if you had a nationwide college football players union is that they would make it more interesting to watch. Actually, if you had player input, you would probably have a more interesting and more competitive game rather than, you know, elite schools like Alabama and the like taking all of the recruits and making the game, you know, just, you know, it's the same people in the playoffs every year. So,
yeah, I mean, I could go off about this as a college football fan because you have seen, just as inequality has gotten worse in our economy and our society, it has, you know, trickled into sports and including college sports. You know, longtime listeners will know I'm a Southern Miss fan and grew up a big Southern Miss fan. Southern Miss is one of those smaller schools that is Division 1A. It is in what they call the Group of Five, the G5 schools. So UAB, Troy, Southern Miss, Memphis, you know, schools like this that are not making the big bucks on their programs, and they are struggling to keep up with the arms race. But, you know, 25 years ago, those programs, there was a lot more parity. Yeah. And so, you know, a school like Southern Miss could beat Alabama on any given Saturday. Right. Maybe not every Saturday, but maybe 1 out of 3, 1 out of 4, right? And the distinction between the talent was not as vast. And, you know, the distinction in the money that was being created. And so what it looks like to me is like the SEC and the Big Ten, and maybe a couple other schools are going to join in with this, but I think the Big Ten and the SEC are trying to essentially break away from Division 1A, and you'll have basically a super league of your Ohio States, your USCs, your Alabamas, and then everybody else left to do whatever they can. You know, and sports talk is like on fire about, you know, college football and college sports in general is like the wild, wild west. Right. There's so much talk about NIL money, transfer portal. You know, there's talk about some of that push Nick Saban into retirement maybe earlier than he wanted to. I mean, if you turn on ESPN or sports talk radio, it's obsession. The landscape of college sports, so to speak. And one thing that's really missing from that is that even when folks talk about player compensation and stuff, they
don't have the seat at the table.
They don't have the seat at the table, right? And so I am glad that some players are now making some money, but that's not the same as negotiated agreement. That's not the same as like the equity that can be brought into the situation when you have collective bargaining happening. So yeah, I think the player input, the voice at the table is really huge. I love to see this at Dartmouth. I want to see it spread. It'll be interesting to see if the union movement spreads at the private schools, while the public sector schools are a little bit, well, it's a little trickier, right? And so will that be a distinction in recruiting and in like attracting players, right? Like I could go to a union school or I could go to a public school, right? That could be a real factor here in the next couple years. So that'll be interesting to see.
Right. Yeah. Well, and, absolutely. We need to see this spread, and God willing it does. And maybe even with the public schools, you see something like a joint employer rule where the NLRB rules that they're also employees of the NCAA, and then they're able to unionize in that way. I don't know if that would be able to work, but if there's enough of a movement from the college football players, then the change will come. The laws will follow it.
Right.
That's how this happens historically.
It's just like with anything else, right? You have to organize from the bottom up, and the rank and file players have to organize amongst themselves to build their power.
Yeah. But Tommy Tuberville is not excited about this. Let's listen to his response to Dartmouth College basketball players.
Senator, good to talk to you. As most people know, NCAA has long had rules prohibiting the paying of amateur athletes other than scholarships. They recently relaxed the rules a bit on endorsements. But would this vote essentially turn the Dartmouth men's basketball team into professionals? And how big a deal could that be?
Well, you're exactly right, John. It's and they're going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. All these athletes are, because it pays for everything. It pays, scholarships are paid, men and women. There's a lot of people that don't bring in money to universities, but what's going to happen here is you're going to see groups of people that's going to try to unionize, and then it's going to spread across the country. We've been fighting it here. Joe Manchin and I did an NIL bill that was bipartisan, but it kept unionization out, but the Democrats wanted it in. That's the reason we haven't got it to the floor. But this will absolutely kill college sports. The last time I looked, they're not employees. These students are student athletes.
Okay, pause it there for a second.
It's going to kill college sports.
It's so absurd just on its face, the idea that if we give the people who make the money a say in how that money is distributed, it's going to kill college sports. And it's the idea that unionization anywhere is going to be devastating for the industry and is going to necessarily make the industry go under, when newsflash, workers have an interest in their jobs continuing to be, right? And that's just so obvious. It's just so frustrating, the either idiocy or lies being peddled by people like Tommy Tuberville because they don't want the people creating the wealth to be able to have a say in its distribution. That's the fundamental thing. He goes on to say, and we'll hear this, that he's not opposed to people receiving some amount of compensation, but ultimately, and he doesn't say this, but this is what he means, I don't want them to have a say over it. If they get compensation, I want it to be granted to them by their betters at our discretion. And that's the issue there. Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
If you want the federal government involved and ruin something, you try to make them student athletes, employees. Federal government will get involved. Unions will get involved, and it will be a total disaster.
Also, the idea that student athletes are not workers is so silly. There's a recent case that the NLRB is pursuing against the University of Southern California, I believe it is, where the NLRB in this federal court is laying out all of the restrictions that these football players have. And no doubt it's exactly the same and probably even worse at a university like Alabama or Auburn, where football is the thing there. And the idea that it's not a job is just so silly. It requires a full-time commitment, maybe even more. You're restricted on the activities that you can do outside of practices, outside of games, and you're creating value. I mean, that's a job. That's a job. If you don't, and the only reason that you wouldn't want to say that is because it's detrimental to acknowledge the reality, detrimental to your bottom line. To people like Tommy Tuberville, who was a college football coach and who got $5 million from the taxpayers of Alabama to quit, and who still receives a pension from the public university system that is higher than the median salary of Alabamians. He gets more in his retirement than the majority of Alabamians make who work every single year. And this guy is talking about people killing the goose that laid the golden egg, people getting more than they deserve. Let's continue.
So this was spearheaded by a couple of juniors, Kate Haskins and Romeo Murthel. Here's what they said about the effort. They said, "Today is a big day for our team. We stuck together all season and won this election. It is self-evident that we as students can also be both campus workers and union members. Dartmouth seems to be stuck in the past. It's time for the age of amateurism to end." They say this idea of student athletes being unpaid is this thing of the past.
Well, they are getting paid, and I'm not against student athletes making some money, because it's a full-time job being an athlete and a full-time job being in academics. But there's a way forward where they can do both without unionizing. You can't.
Oh, so they're employees except when we have to bring unions into the situation.
Right.
Can't get government and unions involved. Unions have ruined our education system across the country. I was in a union when I first got into coaching in high school. Man, has it gone downhill, John. We can't allow this to happen. Coaches are going to get out of the business. Coaches are right now have a little bit of control of the football team or the basketball team or gymnastics. The problem is unions get involved. They will go on strike right before a championship game. They will hold hostage.
Pause that. This guy talking about coaches have control now. I mean, that's real, that's saying the quiet part out loud there, right? Is that he wants the people in the management positions to have control over the majority black athletes that don't get compensated without them being able to have any say over what happens. And what he mentioned there about them going on strike before a national championship game, that's called leverage, buddy. That's called leverage. The national championship game makes a bunch of money because of them. So, yeah, and they should have the right to withhold their labor, because this is the United States of America, and you should have the freedom to do that if you want and if you feel like it's necessary to get the things that you deserve.
Also, because he doesn't really understand how unions and contracts work.
Right.
The only way that happens is if you have the national championship contender whose contract expires right before the championship, or, something like to that effect. You have an unfair labor practice strike, perhaps. I mean, players aren't just going to do this willy-nilly, like in the middle of a contract, right?
Yeah, and
there's no strike clauses typically in most contracts anyway. Yeah, right.
You know, audience, how Adam knows that about this, that it's unlikely actually that student athletes are going to go on strike before a national championship game, because we have professional sports. And when was the last time that such a thing happened? The MLB, I believe, went on strike, or they were actually locked out. They were locked out by the
owners.
By the owners. That was the last time that such a thing happened, and that's the only time that such a thing has happened in the last decade, the last 2 decades. That these things are incredibly rare, and the idea that this is going to be a pressing issue for college sports is just absurd.
The people that are paying the bills,
So here's one of the things that I'm wondering. When you look at Dartmouth, its basketball program is fairly small. It's in the Ivy League. It's Division I. Yeah. But it brings in $1.3 million a year in revenue. So if they're going to get paid, it's from a very small pot. But when you look at some of these other major basketball dynasties, Duke, revenue in 2020 was $33 million. UConn, $24 million. UNC, $31 million. Kentucky, $22 million. Indiana, nearly $26 million. Could student athletes look at this and say, holy cow, that's a huge pot of money. Let's do what everybody in Dartmouth did and get our piece of it.
Well, the problem you have there, too, is a lot of that money, and most of the money goes to scholarship programs. It goes to facilities for men and women. This is profit, obviously, but profit goes back into the business.
You know what? At the bargaining table, we can sort all that out.
Yeah.
Because we'll have the right to information request.
Again, I'm all for student athletes making some money, but I'm for all of them making money. It should be revenue sharing. Everybody, men and women in every sport that's on scholarship, should have the opportunity to probably get the same amount of money. Then the NIL kicks in, and if you're good enough, you can go out and sell yourself. But that's what...
Also, isn't that probably what the union's going to try to do?
No, the union is going to stop people from being able to sell yourself to advertisers. Because that's what we've seen, again, in professional sports.
Right. It's so ridiculous.
What it was supposed to be all about.
All right. Well, we'll see where the legislation goes, and we'll see where this goes. Senator, great to catch up with you. Thanks so much for your time.
You too.
Stupidest U.S. senator. The stupidest person in the Senate. Joe in the Facebook chat says Tuberville has the biggest ears in the Senate and nothing between them, and that's exactly right. I mean, so idiotic.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, clearly has no idea how unions actually work.
Right.
He is just gonna, continue that anti-union bigotry that his funders and backers, want him to spread. He's not going to do a very great job at it because he is, as you said, the biggest idiot in the U.S. Senate.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.
Which side are you on?